Good morning and welcome to our third interview with Eileen McCafferty DiFranco as we continue our discussion on her book, The Cost of Sainthood. In the beginning of the chapter on the Apostle, you used a quote that said that history is written backwards and cleans up the mess of the past. How does that quote figure into Scripture and theology?
Well, Scripture, both the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament and the New Testament, is not history. Scripture, instead, is a record of a people's faith journey. And people do not usually understand the various legs of their faith journey while they are traveling along it. Instead, they look back, as did the travelers along the road to Emmaus, and they think, were not our hearts burning as various incidents in the past began to make sense, even though the incidents might have occurred generations before? And so they recorded their understanding of the events generations later. As New Testament scholar Marcus Borg wrote, Scripture is a combination of historical meaning and metaphorical narratives, all of which point to a theological, but not necessarily historical truth.
Can you explain that further?
Yes. There was no one following Jesus or Moses or Isaiah around with a pen and paper, recording their every word and deed during their lives, because the vast majority of the people were illiterate. The apostles abandoned Jesus and so were conspicuously absent during his trial and crucifixion. So they had no idea actually what was transpiring. And it is improbable that his followers were committing his words and deed to memory, because they didn't realize who Jesus was until long after he died. Scripture reflects what some of his followers might have very imperfectly remembered, or what the proto-Christians were writing about, and writing their own understanding of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection decades after he died. These beliefs were written back into what eventually became the New Testament.
Why is the Apostle Paul so important to understanding the New Testament?
Unlike the Gospels, Paul's epistles are primary sources about people who actually existed in the early days of the Jesus movement. They are the best source of information about the earliest followers of Jesus because they were written within 20 years after Jesus died. Unlike the authors of the Gospels, Paul actually knew Peter, James, and John personally. In fact, he knew many of the early movers and shakers of the Jesus movement who were not listed in the Catholic canon of saints, but who were clearly much more important than the 12. These letters that were actually written by Paul, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philemon, Galatians, Philippians, and Thessalonians, reflect what people were actually believing in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And these letters do not contain many of the ideas and stories in the gospel.
What do you mean?
So, just for instance, Paul makes no mention of what Christianity came to regard as dogmas of the faith, like the perpetual virginity of Mary. Instead, he says quite casually that Jesus was born of a woman, not a virgin, and doesn't even mention Mary's name. Neither does he mention Jesus' betrayal by Judas, or Pilate's hand-washing, or Barabbas. He does not write down any of the teachings of Jesus or record any of his miracles. He does speak at great length about the resurrection, which is central to his theology, but not in the same way that the Gospels do.
Paul, along with Peter, are regarded as bishops and founders of the Church of Rome. Is this true?
Paul wrote his letter to the church in Rome that already existed. So no, he did not found the church in Rome, and neither did Peter. Paul lists the names of the people who were members of that church in Rome, and he does not include Peter, with whom he disagreed on many things. Most modern scholars do not believe that Peter and Paul were either in Rome either together or separately. And neither man was either a bishop or a priest, offices that did not exist in the early church. Instead, Paul described himself as he described his co-worker Phoebe, as a deacon or a servant.
So who founded the church in Rome?
Romans 16 is very, very clear about the founders. Paul addressed his letter to Prisca and Aquila and to the church that met at their house. Prisca and Aquila are mentioned 5 times in the New Testament because they were so very important to the early followers of Jesus. The people of God deserve to know that the founding of what eventually became Christianity was far more diverse than the institution would have us believe.
Did the members of the 12 found churches?
Maybe. However, Paul does not mention the names of any members of the 12 except for Peter, James, and John. Nor does he indicate that they were heads of churches like Prisca and Aquila. But he does mention Junia and Andronicus as preeminent among the apostles. He also mentions the deacon Phoebe, a member of the church at Cenchreae, who possibly could have been the founder of that church. He describes the list of people in Romans as working hard in the Lord, and their names are Persis, Mary, Tryphena, Tryphosa, the sister of Rufus, who were either members of Prisca and Aquila's church or who had branched out to found new churches. After the death of Jesus, most of the 12 listed in the Gospels disappeared into the mist of history.
Why is it important to understand that the stories about the 12 apostles are legendary?
It's important because the leaders of the institution fashioned them into priests, bishops, and founders of churches who were martyred for their faith. The canonization by the church lifted up obscure men who had little to do with the growth of the church into the ranks of saints, while the real workers in the vineyard were ignored because they were women or married couples. It bears repeating that the church founders were much more diverse than the institutional church would have the people of God believe. In addition, there were no bishops, there were no priests, but rather deacons or ministers and servants, elders and overseers in what was a very, very small movement. Some scholars believe 1,000 people by the year in the entire Roman Empire by the year 60.
If Peter did not found the church at Rome, why is he regarded as the first pope?
The earliest writings of the proto-Christians living in Rome do not mention a pope. Instead, according to the late 1st century or early 2nd century Shepherd of Hermas, another primary source, Rome was ruled by a council of elders. Saint Ignatius of Antioch, who wrote in the beginning of the 2nd century, was the Papa or Pope of Antioch, and he knew nothing about a pope in Rome. The idea of a supreme pontiff in Rome, beginning with Peter, was begun by 2nd century popes who wanted to justify their power by establishing the idea of apostolic succession, beginning with Peter, who allegedly received the keys of the kingdom from Jesus. In reality, Jesus and not Peter is the rock upon which the Christian movement was built.
Weren't Peter and Paul martyred by Nero in Rome?
Probably not. As I said, most scholars don't believe that they ever lived or worked in Rome, so we really don't know what happened to them.
I thought Nero unleashed a pogrom?
Pogrom.
I thought Nero unleashed a pogrom against Christians after the Great Fire in year 60 of our Common Era.
The number of people who followed Jesus in the year 60 of the Common Era was so small that they met in people's homes. They did not call themselves Christians, nor did anyone else for another 50 years. Instead, they were Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. Consequently, Nero would not have known about a discrete group of people called Christians. Nero, of course, did brutally execute those who almost destroyed Rome in the Great Fire. Any follower of Jesus, included in the number of the dead, could have been caught up in an unfortunate dragnet, but they were not executed for their faith. In addition, Nero, modern historians now say, is not the evil emperor that the historian Tacitus made him out to be in the fire story. Tacitus wanted to discredit the Julian-Claudian line, of which Nero was its last member, to justify his overthrow and assassination by the new imperial family, the Flavians. Scholars now regard the record of Tacitus about Nero and the persecution of Christians to be unreliable.
Thank you, Eileen, for this discussion about the apostles.
You're welcome.